Ding, 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 ding.
Welcome to Talking Pictures Trivia, the podcast in which a group of Welcome to Talking Pictures Trivia, the podcast in which a group of
B-side. All right, and welcome back to B-side. I am Tom, and then B-side's most consistent guest of all time and occasional host of B-side, KJ, is here from our flagship podcast, and today we are talking about Colossal, the 2016 film directed by Nacho Vigalondo, our only repeat director so far from our flagship podcast, Talking Pictures Trivia. And in that podcast, we had begun to talk about, let me let KJ say hello. Do you want to say hello, KJ?
Hey, Tom, thanks for having me back again. You guys being the audience, may have noticed that the Colossal episode was significantly shorter than our others. We're hoping to keep the flagship podcast down that low, possibly, or at least we're experimenting with it, and then move some of the conversation over here to the B-side, where we can go in further. So good to be back. I'm looking forward to learning a lot about absurdity, Tom.
Yes, we're going to work on absurdity, absurdism, and all that. And so just kind of maybe behind the scenes look at the flagship. KJ does most of the work of the show. And part of it is, prepares some Google Docs, and we put in our notes into these Google Docs. And a lot of my notes were on absurdity, theater of the absurd, things like that. And that was kind of my reading of Colossal, was that it's a kind of like an absurdist light picture. And I don't think we got very far down that rabbit hole, did we?
No, I don't think so.
Maybe not even a little bit. So we decided, to kind of maybe make this movie worth our time and discuss this concept in a little more detail. So through to you. So any kind of ideas about absurdity or absurdism or existentialism or whatnot going into this discussion today?
So before I saw your show notes for Colossal, I had never even heard of absurdism. So can we get just a general, what is absurdism?
Sure. So absurdism is, it comes from this critic, Martin Esslin, in his book titled Theater of the Absurd from kind of the mid-20th century. And he's looking at a collection of writers who were, he felt, being misunderstood. People like Samuel Beckett, who were writing plays, and the critical response to those plays were something along the lines of, this makes no sense. Is this even dialogue? What the hell is this? And he was looking at that. He was looking at Eugene Ionesco in France, potentially Pirandello in Italy, and saying, well, the evaluative strategies of these critics are lacking. They do not take into account what the nature of this is, and so he came up with the term theater of the absurd. The absurd being a term he invents to kind of tie these disparate but somewhat similar plays together into a unified genre. Now, even using the term, he would never use the term genre. He would say it's a label, because these plays are varying. And he finds a few conventions at the outset for these plays. And he says that these plays consistently exercise a devaluation of language. They are not story reliant. There is little or no plot. And that could mean also there's little or no explanation for things that are happening. There are no or few recognizable characters. The worlds that the plays occur in are kind of dreamlike nightmares. And there is a stress on incoherence. Action and word don't necessarily line up.
Why don't we jump into one of these in terms of Colossal? Do you think Colossal exemplifies one of these conventions?
Yes and no, right? And I think this is where the kind of idea of a 21st century absurdist drama, absurdist comedy. I would say this is a comedy, definitely. Um, Kind of needs to be kind of chiseled out. Because a lot of this stuff, a lot of the absurdist stuff, is kind of being written during the Cold War, being written after World War II, after the discovery of the Holocaust, and in part, it's kind of a response to that feeling maybe of alienation, or the feeling of there's a lack of explanation for existence. And so we could go through these conventions and see where in the 21st century, at least where in terms of Colossal, they sort of fall short. So,
Sure.
yep. So let's start with like devaluation of language.
My initial thoughts there are there is no devaluation of language in Colossal. I mean, there was certainly dialogue. Um, there was no time where the characters all just stared at each other without knowing. Is that what they mean by devaluation of language? What's usually meant by that?
I think what is meant by that, or what you usually see, is that the words people say don't do what words on stage or on film normally do, right? So you might, say, can you get me a cup? And that means quite literally, please go get me a cup. I want to drink something out of it, or whatever. But what you'll see in, like, let's say a lot of the shorter plays of Samuel Beckett, for example, is that people will kind of repeat things or say things, and it's kind of hard to tell what those words are intended to do, or what they're intended to summon, right, from out of people. Very often the language itself doesn't have the kind of active intonation that you would see in kind of a realistic play, a realistic movie. And furthermore, the language doesn't necessarily have a metaphorical meaning that you would see in a more complicated, realistic play. So, for example, another Samuel Beckett play, Waiting for Godot, probably the most famous absurdist drama, two older men are waiting on a road for Godot, and he never comes, and that's the absurdism. Beckett never really defined what Godot was, and to say Godot is a metaphor for something, people often say God, right? Godot. It gets you to God pretty quickly if you play with the letters. But to say that Godot is a symbol or a metaphor for something is to kind of misunderstand the form, right? It's just people. It's an absurd situation. It's not a metaphor.
So in Colossal, I think all the language is literal, right? Every time they ask for a cup, they're looking for a cup.
Yeah.
And there's nothing strange there. However, I guess by the end, none of it really mattered, right? None of the characters really grew or changed or arced.
Yeah, I mean, I would push back against that in terms of, especially of Anne Hathaway's character, who literally seems to get over alcoholism by the end of the movie.
Oh, that's true. She does. She is drinking a lot less.
Yeah.
By the end.
But by the third act, she's not drinking at all, right? Or she's
Right,
unless she's
right.
forced to by the main villain, Jason Sudeikis's, what's his name? Joel?
Is it Oscar?
Oscar, thank you. Yeah,
Oscar.
Yeah. So I think that what we see here with language is that it does something, and that you have in Colossal kind of conventional arcs of development. I think it's true of Oscar too. He just goes through a negative change, right, or fails to change.
Right. And I mean, we can dive into that more, but I think it's so sudden. It almost feels like not an arc, but a forced fake. Oh, I need this character to do this now.
Yeah,
It wasn't a.
It's contrived, right? His
Right. Yep.
his villainy is contrived for people who haven't seen it. Which who is listening to this who hasn't seen this movie?
Yeah. Who's listening to this?
Yeah, who's listening to this generally? It's like our parents, I think. But
I hope.
yeah, right. But
All right. Let's look at one of the other conventions. So no or few recognizable characters.
that I think is straight out. We're already kind of talking
Right.
about that.
Yeah. We.
Mhm.
Right.
That doesn't
Yep.
work.
Mm-hmm.
So they're characters here. I do think, though, when we get to know our little story, the next thing, I think we have something there, right? And so what?
Yeah,
Well,
I'll agree because any story we have, it still feels unresolved,
mhm,
right? She gets kicked out of an apartment. She goes back to her hometown, but she's not ready to go back to New York by the end of this. She's not ready to stay in the hometown by the end of this, right? There's no
mhm,
resolution to what she wants to do now with her life.
mhm.
And then same with Oscar. Well, I mean, I guess there's resolution to his story, but it's he gets thrown and presumably dies, right?
Mhm.
But again, there was no redemption or anything right before that.
Mhm.
It was just okay. Now there's no more Oscar.
Yeah, I think though that at least we have one character who has a redeeming story arc. Then that's conventional enough,
Okay.
right? And I think she does have a redeeming story arc, right? She figures out her life and she's able to do something in the world that's good, and stop being self-destructive.
Okay. So of our first three, devaluation of language, we don't really think that applies to Colossal. No or few recognizable characters. They're all very recognizable, even though there might be a few compared to a Marvel movie or something. But
Right,
it's
yeah.
not part of this absurd. Yeah.
Hmm.
No or little stories right out. So far, it's not looking um, too good. But should we jump into the next one?
Well,
Dreamlike or Nightmare Worlds?
yeah, Dreamlike and Nightmare Worlds, and then the last one is Incoherence in Action and Word. I think maybe we're closer. I don't think we're in a Dreamlike or Nightmare World.
Well, so yeah, so talking about the dreamlike or nightmare worlds, or even the incoherent action, maybe this is where we can say, in Mainhead, I think is the name of the town they're in.
Hmm.
Maybe there it's not absurdist, but in Sewell, maybe there it's absurdist, right? All of a sudden, all these start fitting. There's language that we don't understand.
Hmm.
There's little or no story. This monster shows up, destroys buildings, and disappears. There's no recognizable characters apart from the monster, who is not recognizable to anything else we know. I mean, except for maybe Godzilla or King Kong or something. But um, it's dreamlike and it's nightmare.
Yes and no. The fact that something fantastical occurs in a world doesn't make the world surreal, right? I mean, you could compare this to like a David Lynch movie where we are occasionally entering a dream world, and the physics of the world are constantly sort of changing. They're very liquid. In this world, everyone is shocked that a monster has appeared in Seoul, right? It's not like we're not living in a dream where bizarro things happen all the time. The attention the monster gathers is because we're living in the real world, and this is not something the real world is supposed to tolerate, right? And even we hear in the news report that people are going to have to change their definition of how physics works because we now need this explanation. And even at the end of the movie, we get a kind of bad explanation for where the monster comes, that she was holding a doll that looked like a monster when she got struck by lightning or something and was angry. Doesn't really make a lot of sense, but there you go. So I would say no, it is not necessarily a nightmare world.
Gotcha. So part of absurdism is people in universe are very accepting of whatever this absurd thing is, or accepting might not even be the right word. They're nonchalant about what it is.
The world, kind of, yeah. I mean, not always, but kind of. So again, Waiting for Godot is sort of our archetype here, because I think it was Eslin's archetype. In Waiting for Godot, it's not like these two idiots are waiting for Godot and everybody else is going to work and raising a family and going, why are two homeless idiots waiting for Godot for 50 years? It's sort of like people visit them who are just as absurd as they are. A little boy comes and says, "Oh, Godot will come tomorrow, mate." And the play was originally written in French by an Irishman, so I don't know why the boy has an English accent. But anyway, that's what happens there. There's like two other characters. One's a slave and one's a master, and the master's whipping the slave. And none of this really adds up to a world we recognize as our own. Right. In Edward Albee's work, it's maybe a little closer to our world. If we look at like Seascape, for example, it's a married couple on a beach discussing retirement when two sea lizards who have kind of humanoid language abilities and intelligence wash up and start asking them questions about what's it like to live on land and what are conventions. And so they'll have long discussions about like shaking hands and things like that. That's a little less maybe archetypically absurd because it's the world isn't entirely unrecognizable, but even in Albee, we're living in a world where humanoid sea creatures wash up on land and discuss retirement plans, right? It's while with this movie with Colossal, it's our world, and then it's a world we recognize as our own, but with one bizarre element, which is a big thing has shown up. I mean, the same way Marvel movies take place in our world, right? Marvel is imagine our world, but there's superheroes, and they try to make the superheroes realistic. They come from somewhere, they have stories, they don't just pop out of nowhere.
All right, but how about the last one then? Incoherence in action and word. Does that fit Colossal?
I think so, and I think this is where kind of the like American absurdist light kind of comes in, and I think that the monster or monsters in Colossal are sort of they kind of come from nowhere. The definition we're given for them also doesn't make sense, as I said before. Lightning hits her, but and apparently it also turns him into a monster, even though he isn't hit by lightning. It's a bad explanation, and the movie feels like it's tacked on anyway. But the incoherence is that when she steps onto a park at 8:05, a giant monster appears in Seoul, and there's really no reason for it. And I think then that incoherence, meaning that lack of reason, that lack of justification, or that very bad justification, highlights the absurdist element as something that can convey knowledge. We could see an example of this in an absurdist play by Luigi Pirandello, Six Characters in Search of an Author, in which people are staging a play and six characters from a play walk out and say, "Hey, can you write a play for us? We need to do this." Yeah, which also kind of, I mean, think about so there is a definition, and this might be where I'm wrong in my hypothesis. The explanation is that the two people who can become monsters, Oscar and Gloria.
Gloria. Yep.
Yeah, played by Hathaway and
Jason Segal. I don't know his name either.
Sudeikis. There it is. Yeah, Segal.
Steven's son.
Steven Seagal. That when they were kids, they went into the area that later would become the playground. She had a diorama of the city of Seoul. He's really mean, so he stepped on it and crushed it. As he did, lightning hit her in the head while she was near a toy that looked like a monster. And then whenever she steps on the playground at 8:05, presumably the time this happened, she turns into that monster in the city of Seoul because she was angry and looking at a diorama of Seoul while being relatively close to this doll. And so does Jason Sudeikis' character.
Yeah, and if we take that out, because it does feel tacked on, would we even need an explanation as to why this occurs in the movie? Does it change the plot? Does it change the theme? Does it change nothing,
No.
right?
Yeah.
So either way, I'd say it's incoherent. And is it incoherent in an absurdist way?
That's a really good question. I think that's the question more than is the explanation supportable or believable. And so the kind of the idea of incoherence is that, philosophically speaking, is that people are separated from the world, right? That meaning cannot be made in the world, or you have to sort of manufacture it. You have to do something absurd and call that meaning, right? Just point to that and say that action is meaningful. That's my meaning. Meaning isn't like true or out there or real. And so it seems like we have to ask the question: does the monster or monsters show the world to be lacking meaning, and then these people have to try and find meaning using the monsters, or do the monsters reify a meaning or a higher order in the world?
Well, let's start with Gloria and Oscar's character.
Mm-hmm.
They seem wandering, right? They're not. They don't have big goals in life. They're not progressing towards anything. I mean, Oscar's running the bar, but he doesn't want to be. It seems.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start with them and say, I think it's safe to say their life doesn't have a purpose at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so if that's the case, then when the monster shows up, the monster has no purpose in soul, right? There's no reason for the monster to be there.
Mm-hmm.
It is destructive, so that's something that's a meaning. That could be something. Um, but does Soul learn anything from the monsters? Does Gloria or Oscar learn anything by being monsters?
Yeah, I don't know if it's well, I would say Gloria is sort of forced into a position of responsibility via the monster. I don't know if learning something is the idea or the key. It's I don't know if it's necessarily, it could be, but I don't think it necessarily needs to be a sort of morality fable. Um, and there's a reading of this involving fable that we could talk about. I do want to talk about, but I'm just going to table that a second to respond to this idea of learning. I think that like Soul doesn't really learn anything, right? We don't learn why this makes any sense. I do think that as a metaphor, it's supposed to represent the kind of destruction that Gloria's drinking does, or Jason Sudeikis' character's Oscar's his controlling and drinking. It's a little more vague with him. General badness, I guess, that represents. But I don't know if it's. I don't know if it. I don't think it has a kind of literal meaning in the world of the film.
Even not learning a moral lesson. I was trying to think, is there any advantage to having this monster out there? Like, could could Soul have set up a giant hamster wheel
Mm-hmm.
and had Gloria run in place and expend very little energy and generate a lot of energy in Soul? Right? It is what could they have done something good with this sci-fi premise?
Well, I mean, I think the problem with saying let's do something kind of, I don't know, ethically positive with having or generating a giant monster. Um, I think that kind of. So I think this actually dovetails into this idea of the parable, the absurdist parable, right? So what you're suggesting is, I think, a different parable from the one we're given, right? So if you're saying that, so let's start with this kind of idea of the absurdist parable, and then we'll talk about how that connects to what I think the film is doing and what you're suggesting would be maybe a better potential.
Sure, sounds good.
Okay, so the idea of the absurdist parable, I'm just going to go into my notes here, um, is that what you're given is kind of an open paradox. And the open paradox presents kind of clashing ethical concerns. And those clashing ethical concerns kind of force us to contemplate certain problems, certain ethical problems, that there's a clash of meanings and we have to deal with that clash of meanings. And thereby, people find meaning in their life by dealing with paradox, right? And so the absurdist movie, play, what have you, by presenting a paradox, by presenting something that appears to be impossible, the quest to unpack that paradox provides meaning for the audience. Um, and so, in a sense, this is absurdism tends to be pretty negative. It's a downer, but with this type of thing, it's much more positive, much more life affirming. That we're kind of meaning makers, and so when we look at this movie, we seek to read it and make meaning out of it. Now, the meaning I make out of it is that this is a metaphor for the kind of damage her drinking does, right? For the damage of alcoholism, and her having to eventually kind of throw away the monster, which she does literally at the end, is her trying to, get over this problem that she's caused for herself and caused for others. I think if we're going to kind of switch up the parable or the paradox, or switch up the parable, we're presenting a new paradox, which is that the absurdist notion of a monster becomes like, hey, what can we do? How can we utilize this monster? Let's make her run on a wheel and generate a lot of energy for Soul.
Mm-hmm.
And so then the absurdity there is possibly the need for utilizing or putting to practical use every phenomena in the world, right? And I think that would actually be a little more interesting, right? Because
Right.
because it's like, well, maybe we can just enjoy the weirdness or the absurdity instead of practicalizing it. Here, I think this movie's a lot simpler than the movie you would have liked to be made.
Yeah, I guess kind of what I'm proposing. It reminded me of Monsters Inc. Have you seen Monsters Inc., Tom? The Pixar
I
movie?
haven't. No, go for it. I have.
In Monsters Inc., the plot revolves around Mike Wachowski and Sully, who work in the scare factory. So they go through closet doors and come out of kids' closets and scare them. The scream of kids is what powers the town.
Mm-hmm.
By the end of the movie, spoilers for Monsters Inc., everybody, they realize that laughter is 10 times stronger than screams. So they start sending comedic monsters through to capture that
Mm-hmm.
energy. But I'm just wondering, is Monsters Inc. an absurdist um, because the monsters are okay with just scaring the living snot out of children everywhere, where we wouldn't, uh, accept that as a moral way of gathering energy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what it sounds like from your description and from the previews that there's a coherent world that's going on here. Incoherence isn't like Peter Pan, right? The absurd isn't Peter Pan. I mean, Peter Pan is fantastical, but he's traveling to a world with defined rules and a defined conflict, and there you go. Like the Lord of the Rings is an absurd, right?
Right.
Yeah, there's a logic, a rational order to this world. There's ways of killing the Nazgul, and and you could exercise them. And we know what the Nazgul is. It's not absurd. Would be if you were in a 4th of July picnic, hanging out, and the Nazgul landed next to you, right?
And then
You're
just started talking about how much they're looking forward to the fireworks that evening.
Yeah, exactly. Right. The world has been ripped open. There's no coherence here. It doesn't make sense that the Nazgul should be at a fat guy's 4th of July picnic.
Thanks,
You know.
Tom.
I,
So I guess in Colossal, part of that absurd is the monster shows up out of nowhere, right? It kind of comes in a cloud
Mhm.
and it just steps onto. So that's kind of what pointed you in the direction of the absurdity.
Yeah, that's what pointed me there. Is that there is no this is not part of the logical rules of this world. It's not, but it's still kind of absurdist light. And why I wanted to do this with you is that we're not seeing the hard absurdism of, let's say, Lewis Carroll, right? Alice in Wonderland. That is more. I mean, yes, if she goes down this tunnel or something, she goes into Wonderland. But the people say nonsense things. You have a potion and you grow big and then small and then you could go into rooms. I mean, the structure of that world is hard to define. Or the kind of the Jabberwocky stuff, right? That's really absurdist. It's a poem that is written in such a way that the language doesn't manifest a kind of visual analog that you can have as a reader of the poem, right? The poem is sort of self-canceling. That's the absurdity of language in that case, where language, which normally conveys something, here ends up conveying nothing. And I think what we have with this movie is maybe not an incoherence of language, but is certainly a lack of explanation. A movie that proposes the world is explanatory and then gives us something that isn't explained. Right? We're only explained in terms of this kind of metaphor, or what I'm calling an absurdist parable. It's not really a parable, absurdist lesson possibly. Yeah, something like that.
Huh. Would you say Shaggy Dog stories are generally absurdist?
What are Shaggy Dog stories?
Shaggy Dog stories would be
Mm.
something. I'll tell you a story about one of my Shaggy dogs. So, one of my dogs got out one day and started walking down the street. He went down to the end of the street. He made a left. Happened to see one of our neighbors who tried to call him over, but just kept going. Eventually got to a storefront, went into the store. Everybody was pretty surprised to see him, but they were pretty happy. They said hello. He then left the store and he came back home.
Mm-hmm.
That's a Shaggy dog. There's no point to the story. It just
Oh, yeah,
kind of
yeah, I see.
meanders on, and then there's the end. Like,
Yeah, it could. Yeah, I think that it could be depending on how it's used. Yeah, I've seen that before. Now I'm trying to think of where I've seen it or watched a Shaggy Dog story in a play, where the story just didn't have meaning. Um, there's a few of them. I think again in like the shorter plays of Samuel Beckett, but there's a really good one, and I can't put it together what it was again. But it's this kind of this long story that doesn't seem to really have a point, and probably doesn't have a point. Yeah.
right,
Hmm.
right. Hmm.
Yeah. And it wouldn't just be like a joke in a comedy where we have one friend who just tells Shaggy Dog stories, right?
Right. Usually it's a whole, a very long thing that, and it almost seems like it's going to have a point,
Hmm.
but then it doesn't.
Yeah. Actually, here's an example. Elevator repair service might still exist, but they were about 10 years ago, before right when the economy had crashed. They were a big theater company that did kind of they did experimental productions. um, Gats was their big play, where they did and kind of an absurdist play. Like it's an office, and a guy pulls out a copy of The Great Gatsby and starts reading it. And as he's reading it, different people in the office just start, for no reason, taking on the roles that he's reading. But they did a staging of an absurdist staging of Tennessee Williams' Eccentricities of a Nightingale, which I'd be shocked if you know what that is. But it's a play, a Tennessee Williams play with kind of like a kind of Southern belle falling on hard times, that type of thing. And they did an absurd version of it, a short version of it, and she's just telling stories for no reason, and the stories go nowhere. And the guy who is in the play kind of romancing her. Here he's just sort of looking at his watch, and there's no reason for him to be there, and she's just telling these stories that make no sense, and that would be an absurdist Shaggy Dog story. This kind of elevator repair service thing.
How about you had mentioned on our Why Don't You Play in Hell episode one of
Mm-hmm.
that director's short films that took place in a coffee house?
Mm-hmm.
Would that have seen absurdist until the conclusion?
Yeah, I would think so. I almost wish it was. So for people who don't know that, another play by this director. So maybe another play, excuse me, another film by this director. Nacho. We'll just call him Nacho. What's his last name?
Vigilando, I think.
Vigilando. Okay, Nacho Vigilando. And he has a short movie that was nominated for an Oscar for live action short. And
Oh, it wasn't Why Don't You Play in Hell. It was Nacho. It was Time Crimes. We talked about that.
oh
Not
yeah, I'm sorry, Time Crimes. Yeah,
Time
sorry,
Crimes. Great.
that was
No,
very
I had
confusing
said
for our audience.
Why
Yeah.
Don't You Play that? Cool. Yep.
Yeah,
Go
no,
for
I
it.
knew what you meant, and just sort of crushed it together. But anyway, Nacho did this short film, and the plot of it is this guy goes into a coffee house, or a woman goes into a coffee house, and people just start singing. Right, everybody's quiet. Nobody speaks at first. right? And she tries to order coffee. Nobody looks at her. Nobody responds. And then suddenly people just start singing, and and kind of singing to her. And then it turns out that there's this kind of crazy guy who's stalking her, who's has a gun and has a bomb actually, and he's threatening to blow up the place if people don't sing to this girl he has a crush on. But until the very end, you don't know that's happening. So it's just people don't talk to her, and then they start singing to her this kind of love song. That would be kind of absurdist because it's an incoherent action in the world. Mm-hmm. So I think what we kind of want to end on is whether or not this film is absurd or not. What can we say? So if we're taking this movie, let's take this movie as yes absurd, right? And we'll just say it for the sake of this conversation. What then is kind of an American 21st century film, like large audience film absurdism? What is tolerable in that kind of venue?
Like a specific movie? Like, have you seen The Lobster?
Okay, the Lobster is absurd. Exactly. Yeah.
Or I think is it Charlie Kaufman's latest film? I'm thinking of Ending Things.
Yeah, his movies tend to be, and that I have read the review of it. That sounds absurd, right? She changes jobs miraculously, and yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she's with people who every so often will be a different age, either way older, way younger. There's no explanation. The rest of the world seems to be fine with it.
There's incoherence that is that nobody's commenting on, right? It's part of that world.
Right.
So I guess then those things, Kaufman's work, The Lobster, which I watched an hour of before I turned it off because I hated that movie. Terrible movie. But it is absurd.
It is absurd.
Yeah. Is that, I guess, are those conventional absurdist movies, do you think? Based upon what Martin Esslin has outlined for us and what we've talked about today.
Well, in The Lobster, you have this strange premise where people have to fall in love or else they're going to turn into an animal, right? Mm-hmm. They're volunteering to give themselves a time limit on how long they have to fall in love or else they become an animal. I'm assuming because animals don't fall in love like we do, or I don't really know why that was the...
Well, that's the absurdist element, right? No definition.
Mm-hmm. Right. Oh, yeah. That's a good... Mm-hmm. There we go. Stumbled onto that one. And everyone's fine with it. But the only trick with The Lobster is it feels like an isolated place, right? At this hotel, at this retreat they're in, it's absurdist. But I don't know if the rest of the world understands that. Would be the only...
Yeah, I mean, I was given the impression they did. Like, this seems to be the place you go when you are of a certain age and you don't have, and you've lost a loved one or you're no longer with someone. Right? Because I don't think the idea of that movie, it starts with the brother of the main character played by Colin Farrell, has turned into a lobster because he's turned into a dog because he's failed to, find a loved one. And so it seems like they don't want to turn into animals.
Right, but but again, they're kind of volunteering to do this. I mean, it's a Hail Mary, a last hurrah.
It almost seems like a convention. Like, this is what you do in this world.
Oh, more like Logan's Run or something? Like, oh, time's up, you're going to the...
Yeah. It seems like with Logan's Run, it's kind of like a dystopian thing where that's being imposed by the forces of darkness or whatnot, 1984 type thing. With this, it just seems like this is what people do. It's incoherent, right? Why would people do this? Why would people subject themselves to turning into a dog or a lobster if they had another option? It seems, why would people wait 50 years in a row for Godot?
Right.
Like, what's so great about Godot? Well, we don't know. There's no... It's just meaninglessness that's being staged. And I think that's the case in this movie as well. In the case of The Lobster.
But then, to answer your question, I don't know too many people that have seen this movie. I don't know how well it did. I don't know if this fits the modern American, it might have been nominated for an Academy Award.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, I don't know how Colossal did.
oh,
Are you
I don't
talking
think
about
Colossal did very well either.
no? Oh, the Lobster.
Yeah, the
I don't think.
Lobster. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think the Lobster did particularly well either. His later movie, The Favorite, did Oscar stuff. It won Oscars and all that.
Is that Stone? Emily's.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the movie about Queen Anne.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that was I actually enjoyed that. I don't know how absurdist that was.
I know nothing about it. So
Yeah. No, I yeah.
yeah, but yeah. So I guess maybe there is a place still for kind of big budget absurdity. But
Would you say mother exclamation point is absurdist? Did you see
yeah, I did see that. I maybe that's a good point because that's clearly a parable, right?
Yes, I completely missed it till I
Yeah.
read it on Wikipedia, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's the it's the kind of the parable of, well, it's not a parable necessarily. It's the creation story.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
a retelling
It's
of
a retelling it
the,
from like the position of, I guess, the sort of female. Um,
yeah, because in the beginning of the movie she kind of represents the earth
mhm.
maybe, and by the end she's
Yeah.
the Christian Mary.
Yeah, she's Mary, she's Earth, but it seems to be or what's the director's name? Aronofsky seems to
Yeah, Aronofsky.
be repositioning or reusing the biblical story in order to make a parable about kind of environmental damage, right? Because she's Mother
Y-
Earth, and it ends with
The house burning down, does it
the
end
house
with?
in
Is
the
that
field, right? And it
right?
is absurdist in the sense that um, we get no.
Who's the main guy? Who's right? Jennifer Lawrence was the main woman, but who was the main guy
Javier
that kind of,
Bardem,
yeah,
but
because he's totally cool with everything that's going on
yeah,
throughout the
well,
movie.
he's kind of God, right? That's
Right,
this is
right,
where the
right,
parable thing fits, right? He's God. The baby they eat is Jesus.
right.
Um, it's Adam and Eve are Ed Harris and Michelle Pfeiffer
Yep.
because he's missing a rib. We see that at one point.
Yeah. Right.
And then, we have Cain and Abel, are their children, played by Domhnall Gleeson, right? Who?
Yep. But if you don't recognize that on your first watch through,
Mhm.
which again I probably should have, but if you
They
don't
they
recognize that,
even have a flood of Noah.
yeah, right, right. It's yep.
Mhm.
Yeah. Nick would have noticed, but
His
the
eagle eyes.
while you're yeah, he would his eagle eyes. He would have caught that. Yep. Hope he doesn't listen to this. The
He won't.
but I guess without knowing that, it seems very strange what the God character is doing, right? Jennifer Lawrence is like, don't let these people into my house.
Mhm.
Everything about this doesn't make any sense. And he's like, no, it's kind of cool. Like,
Mhm.
they're here, they're fine. It's
Yeah, and they
so,
rip it down. Yeah, I think that's
yeah,
absurdist. Especially since like the house is the size of a field. Well, the world is the size of the field, and people just come out of the field. Um, yeah, the character I think is called the poet, but he's really God in that.
the poet.
And
Yeah, yeah.
that may be kind of an absurdism that combines absurdism with the parable, where he's
Right.
yeah, where it's sort of this. I think you could call it a parable of. It's not of environmentalism or environmental damage. Aronofsky said of it, it was just his response to the 2016 election, which to me makes no sense. I gotta,
Wow.
yeah, that's just what people said back then.
But so as another example of an absurd movie, I also don't think it did very well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess it's a hard thing to sell just because people like coherence. It's, and it's also like
Yeah.
avant-garde is almost by definition doesn't do well, right? It's outside of the mainstream.
Yep.
Mhm.
You'd have to have some shtick that brought people in
Yeah.
to the theater, and then they're just kind of surprised, and then they would tell other people, yeah, it's still worth going to see. I
Yeah.
don't know.
So yeah, maybe mainstream absurdism is not is not a thing that's possible. That it's really, but it's interesting. It's interesting to think of that, right? Because absurdism is about dealing with the meaninglessness of life, and so by it being necessarily on the margins or in the avant-garde, um, it kind of says that people refuse to deal with that aspect. And that doesn't mean you necessarily have to believe that. Like I personally don't believe that. I don't think life is meaningless and we have to find it, in a kind of a Sisyphusian way. So I sort of get it too, right? Like I didn't particularly like Mother or Lobster or Colossus. Waiting for
Right.
Godot is really good because it's really funny. Like when he wrote it, he imagined Laurel and Hardy doing it. So he imagined kind of like broad comedy in it. Um,
Well, I did a quick Google search for what Google considers absurdist
mm-hmm.
movies. So let's just go
Sure, sure,
through down
sure.
the list and say, did we like these?
Mm-hmm.
Are we okay with movies about meaningless things? So Birdman, or the importance of
Mm-hmm.
virtue.
I would agree. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I would agree it's absurd. I didn't enjoy it. I
No, I didn't
was
either.
mostly frustrated with the
Yeah, yeah,
camera.
no,
Yeah, it was.
it's a bad movie.
Doctor Strangelove, loved it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, possibly. I mean, Doctor Strangelove is also really satirical, and it's kind
True.
of clear what they're satirizing. And it seems like absurdity is. Um, it seems like satire requires pretty clear meaning, and absurdity doesn't. Right. So I
Yeah,
think that
so
would be. Yeah.
maybe that's why we enjoyed it. They
Yeah.
put too much meaning into it.
Yeah. It's crazy, but I think it's not or it might even be absurd but not absurdist.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. I'm just thinking of the phone scenes when he's on the phone with Dimitri
Mm-hmm.
or
Oh yeah.
no, yeah,
He's drunk again. Yeah.
um, uh, Anomalisa.
That's the puppet movie, the Kaufman puppet movie. Is that right?
Yeah,
I
yep,
haven't seen that. How is that?
yeah. I didn't enjoy it. The shtick there. Spoilers for everybody. The main character can't recognize faces anymore, so everybody
Oh,
looks the same to him.
yeah. Was it propoagnosia? I think is the term for that. Is that?
Is that? Yeah, I'm not
I
sure.
might be getting that word wrong, but yeah.
Um, but yeah, okay. So Brazil. I didn't enjoy the
Mm-hmm.
movie, but there are absurdist scenes. I'm thinking of when they're in the restaurant and it's like getting blown up and the waiter's still just being a waiter.
Yeah, that seems kind of absurdist. And Gilliam's
Yep.
stuff seems to tend in that direction. And on our Alpha season, we did the Baron von Munchausen. I
Hmm.
would say elements of that are absurdist, but I think that's more like fantastical. It's about kind of
Yeah,
indulging fantasy rather than recognizing meaninglessness.
true. But in Baron Munchausen, things work out for him and he expects them to would be the closest thing I could think of to the absurdism. Or maybe not
Yeah,
absurdism, but absurd.
yeah. I, I think part of that though is I mean, it could be the absurdity of the romantic hero. I.
Well, it's almost like Johnny Depp in Pirates of the Caribbean,
Mhm.
right? He always happens to be standing in the right spot, or his ship is sinking, but he walks right onto that dock, like it all works out, and he kind of expects that,
Yeah,
which is absurd, but not
it's
absurdism.
not. I mean, it's just kind of movie magic, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if convenience is always absurdism, then Hollywood movies are the most absurd movies that have ever been made. Uh, yeah, I don't know with Baron. I think there's absurd elements certainly, right? I think that yeah, like yeah, I think there's absurd elements certainly, it could be. So here's a possible reason, a reading that the world is meaningless, and so these kind of fantastical stories that Munchausen comes up with are his means of importing meaning into the world. Um, However, when we're not in a Munchausen story, there's still a war going on. There's still craziness going on. It's still absurd.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mhm.
Other ones on the list, and I wasn't sure about this one. Did you see Stranger Than Paradise
Oh, I
by
didn't. I really like Jim Jarmusch, but that's his '84 picture, right?
Yeah, I think
Hmm.
so. Yeah, in that movie, it's about a guy whose cousin kind of visits him
Hmm.
in I think it's New York City, and his buddy, and the three of them are just meandering around.
Hmm.
They don't have much to do, so um, yeah, I don't know.
That I know Pauline Kael, who's the critic we cite a lot in the, or I cite a lot in the show. I mean, everybody does, right? She's everybody's favorite film critic. She compared that movie to Waiting to Godot. Waiting for
Oh,
Godot.
okay,
Yeah. So you might get something there, the kind of, kind of isolated meaninglessness. I,
yeah.
I've seen that in other Jarmusch films. You see that with, oh, the Bill Murray film where he is trying to find out if he has a kid. Where he gets a letter from someone unsigned saying you have a child, and he goes on a quest and the child is 18 and is looking for you, and he goes on a quest to find out who the child is.
That movie came up when I was Google searching, um, because I remember reading that plot line, but I don't remember the title of that movie.
Mm-hmm. It's something with flowers, broken flowers.
Oh, Broken
Mm-hmm.
Flowers, not to be confused with Broken
I almost
Blossoms.
said Broken Blossoms, yeah, which is definitely not an absurdist movie. Um, but with that movie, Bill Murray is seemingly playing a character who's incredibly depressed, and no explanation whatsoever is given for his mood. He made a ton of money in computers. That they just say computers, but he doesn't own a computer. The movie opens with a relationship with Julie Depley ending. She's walking out. He asks her to stay, but not in a particularly enthusiastic way. And he goes on this quest, and there's really no explanation given. And not to spoil the movie for you, it's not a great movie, but it has a really interesting ending. Um, it ends with him kind of accidentally running into this guy who's like 18 years old, the age of his presumed son, and he's talking to the guy, and after a while he goes, I know it's you. I know, and the guy's like, get out of here. And he kind of runs away. And Bill Murray kind of chases after him. And then he stops in the middle of the street. And as he does, a car drives by with another 18-year-old in it. And the 18-year-old kind of looks at him and drives off. And Bill Murray just stands there. And it's kind of this absurd moment of, not absurd, excuse me, but this interesting moment of, from here on out, every person of a particular age he sees, he's going to think is his son. And he doesn't know
Hmm.
who. And there's something about the absurd condition of humans in the world addressed in that film, but it's hard to say it's exactly Waiting for Godot. I don't know. Stranger Than Paradise seems like a good contender, even though I haven't seen it.
And I enjoyed it, but I again don't know how well it did.
Probably not. I mean, it's a small picture. I think it's a small
Yeah,
independent picture that got his career
yeah.
started. Maybe we should close with asking the question: is this absurd? Even absurd light? Is this coherent enough?
I understand why you brought this question because again the monster appears out of nowhere, but would the answer be back at the bar?
How so?
Is there any absurdity going on with when Oscar gains control everybody and everybody's doing what he says, or is that logically makes sense because he's threatening to kill people? So I guess that's not absurd. Or maybe like you were saying on the show, before that, before Oscar got this power,
Mm-hmm.
his friends seemed to do whatever he said anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Is
Yeah,
that absurd?
maybe. I mean, you would have to. I would. My reaction would be no, just because you sort of have to highlight that as being something different from what we would recognize, right? Because as soon as he acts like a jerk, everybody goes, "You're acting like a jerk," and they walk away.
That's true.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it
Yeah,
almost gives
that's
the
true.
impression like they just haven't thought this character through, as opposed to.
Yeah.
But if he was kind of, like in Waiting for Godot, we have like the master and the servant, and the master kind of just whips the servant and screams at him, but there's no real reason why the servant should hang out there. It's just sort of, we're called masters of, that's the title, so therefore that's how the person acts. It's sort of established that their relationship is not recognizable to a relationship we would have here. I feel like in Colossal, it's just this character has apparently never acted like this, so it just came out of the blue. Yeah.
Yeah, or if he had before, the other characters have nowhere to go,
Mm-hmm.
so they hang out at the bar anyway and hope
He
he's
stops.
cool
Yeah,
again.
yeah.
Yeah,
Like the next day he sobers up and, you know, whatever. Stops being jealous, maybe.
right.
Mhm. You know, though, of course, in this movie, he seems to, for the first time, have a reason to be jealous of anybody else.
Yes. Although I imagine when he was setting up the bar and closing off that other section, he probably wasn't too pleasant to be around either, right? That would have been another.
Yeah. Yeah, he could be. Yeah. I mean, it seems like his spark is jealousy, but who knows?
Right.
It's a
Yeah.
hard character to read.
Mhm.
So maybe I don't know. I want, so this is what I want. I want an absurdist light where you have this kind of sort of parable thing, like, the parable of alcoholism or something like that comes out of this. But it's a pretty big light. Let's just say the word light is underlined a few times, right? Because when you look at something like the lobster is clearly a different type of animal, than this picture, and it is it may be shoehorning to put them into the same. I don't want to say genre into the in saying that they have the same conventions.
Yeah, I think I have to agree.
Mhm.
I think if we were going to find a proper American absurdist modern day light, I imagine it would be a pretty typical movie, but one character would have the conventions of the absurdist. So either they're doing strange things or they don't react to strange things the same way everybody else in the movie does.
Hmm.
I think that might be a way that we could get an absurdist light movie
Yeah.
out there. Whereas Colossal, everybody's on the same page
Mm.
for the most part.
Yeah, the monster is weird, right? It's not like the monster appears and nobody cares, right? It is this idea that the monster is crazy to the people in the play. Um, so,
I think if you made a sequel, it could be absurdist.
oh, how so?
Well, the one thing that happens in the movie is the monster shows up in Mainhead,
Hmm.
and then we don't see anything, but maybe Mainhead doesn't react, and they're just used to that monster. Like she's living in
Hmm.
Seoul, and that could be a way to.
Yeah, that it's just a a thing that's there.
Right. Like the fire department calls every time a cat's stuck in a tree, and she's like, "All right, I'll get it." Like
Yeah.
things like that. Or is that even absurdist? I guess
Yeah,
that's not
I
absurdist
mean,
either.
if there's a lack of explanation, right? I think there, but yeah, I think maybe we're kind of coming to the conclusion that this doesn't quite work as an absurdist film either.
Yeah.
So the potential redeeming qualities of it, we might have argued out of it. All right, KJ, thanks for doing this B-side with me.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. I was wondering, do these B-sides have any meaning? Are they coherent? Are we verging on something here?
I think they're definitely incoherent, and considering nobody is listening to them, I think it's
We're
quite
right
absurd.
there.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. Please, every Wednesday, Talking Pictures Trivia comes out with a new episode. Tune in wherever you get your podcast, and I will see you on Wednesdays. See you then.